Yeah, so welcome to our paper, mine and Gernot paper on illegalizing spaces, as Stefan was saying. So what we hope to do in this paper is kind of partly derives from a project that we've just relatively recently started on cannabis in Africa. That'll tell you a little bit about in the next slide. So kind of links to this project that we're doing together at the moment, and really looks at the paper. This particular paper kind of looks at this question of how cannabis was transformed in the 20th century from a substance often associated with tradition, elders, and rural space in parts of Africa to one very much associated with criminality, youth, and very urban spaces. So we'll introduce some of the factors involved in this transformation, although we will focus in quite a bit on the relationship of attitudes towards cannabis and the coming of legal prohibitions of the substance in the 20th century. You know, obviously a major point for the introduction of particular policies towards cannabis globally. So we won't not trying to argue that there's some sort of necessarily straight deterministic relationship between, you know, the coming of the illegality at that particular time and changing attitudes towards cannabis, but you know, certainly seems to be a factor that has reinforced how people see, you know, who it is who's consuming cannabis, and also where cannabis is being consumed. So, you know, linking to the theme of the space of the conference. So we'll mention a number of African countries, stroke regions in what follows. Although in my section of the talk, so I'll give the first few slides, and I'll be focusing in particular on Kenya and Uganda. Kenya being principally where I've done most of my research in my career, and as the project goes on, we'll be working more on cannabis in Kenya. While Gernot will focus on Nigeria and the very particular place of Fela Kuti, the famous musician and so, you know, very much a key cultural figure of Nigeria, but Fela Kuti's club, the Shrine. So I'll move to the next slide. So just to tell you a little bit about the project. So Gernot and I, we've done quite a lot of research together over the years on the theme of drugs in Africa. So we've done some quite broad work on you know, how Africa has been targeted in the war on drugs, and this kind of theme in our careers. They're coming from kind of different directions regionally. Myself, as I mentioned, more working in East Africa. And my original research, PhD research, was on the substance cat. So that's how I kind of came to the theme of drugs in African context. Whereas Gernot more coming from the research in Nigeria on principally on the hard drugs trade in his and cannabis as well in his early research. So this kind of led us to develop more recently this project that we've called Cannabis Africana. Drugs and development in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a UK funded, UK Research Institute funded project, and we started it officially back in October last year after, you know, some delays for obvious reasons. And so we're trying to put quite a lot of the groundwork that we need to do into that project, you know, before we can actually travel ourselves. And I should say, so this is a project that's a collaborative project between Gernot and myself, working at the University of Bristol, and a colleague of ours, Simon Howell, who's working at University of Cape Town as well. So, and then we've got collaborative institutions in Kenya and also in Nigeria that we'll be working with. So this is a project that we're really getting our teeth into. So kind of quite a few of the questions we'll be raising in what follows, we'll be looking at in more detail as we move on with the project. And also links to a book project of ours that we've been working on, a more historical book on cannabis in Africa, which should, when it eventually sees the light of day, should have the same title, Cannabis Africana, as the project as well. So quite a bit of the material we've been working on for this paper does link to what we've been working on in the book as well. Like I say, more based on historical archival research that we've both done. So a key theme of the project and our research in general has been this theme of drugs and development, which is quite a key theme at the moment in terms of drugs research. But also in more relevant for this particular paper, we've kind of become quite interested in themes of respectability. Obviously a term that's been used a lot in relation to drugs and patterns of consumption in Europe, but we've kind of been thinking of applying that in the context of in various African contexts as well, and ideas of the middle class and respectability that might come with that. But we've also been looking at this kind of counterpoint form of respectability, a more youth-focused sort of respectability, with the term respect. Something that might have a more hip-hop kind of associations with it. So, and almost in a way, for something to gain respect, almost. Or something can gain respect often precisely because it isn't respectable in the middle class sense. So these are some of the themes that we've been playing with in terms of cat as well as cannabis in this paper, and also the theme resistance, which Gennett will bring up more in the Nigerian context. So like I say, this paper is really looking at this kind of period of the last 120 or so years, and that context of the 20th century in particular, and how things might have changed in terms of associations of cannabis in various African contexts. So just to shift the focus to my part of the paper and more this look on East Africa. So East Africa itself has quite a long history of cannabis consumption and cannabis trade, and likely was a region from where cannabis diffused to much of the other parts of more Central African parts of the continent. And a key link with Indian Ocean trade that there's been with the East African context as well. And a lot of the earlier history of Africa and cannabis is, I'm sure a lot of you will know the work of Chris Duval on cannabis in the African context as well. So he's done quite a lot of work on these earlier histories of it. So I won't get into too much of the detail of that kind of history here. But one thing to mention shows that kind of Indian Ocean links is the way that the term bangi became quite a common one, certainly known throughout Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, East African region. This became the key term that a lot of people do use for cannabis, which obviously shows that kind of Indian Ocean networks, links to bang, a substance that was imported quite a bit. Imports like Mombasa, Zanzibar in the 18th, 19th centuries as well. So cannabis did take on that name, which does in the naming suggest that kind of Indian Ocean links, and it's long been used in many different cultures of consumption, from medicinal to various kind of work context to more leisure contexts as well, and used by many different communities, including people known as the Luo. Who are an ethnicity from Western Kenya, Eastern Uganda, that kind of border region. And this is a picture which I'm not 100% sure whether it will be accurate in its naming, but Nyasore is a Western Kenyan term for cannabis, and this image at least purports to show a Luo man smoking cannabis, Nyasore, and the Luo. They have this, and this is quite common for a lot of other stimulants and intoxicants in Eastern Africa and parts of Africa which had gerontocratic societies, societies that traditionally the elders were supposed to be the ones in control, to have the power in society. And there's a lot with alcohol, and Justin Willis's work, a lot of you will know as well, I'm sure. Historian has done a lot of work on alcohol in East Africa and has looked at this kind of theme of how a lot of people say that alcohol was once something that the young people couldn't consume. You know, in pre-colonial African societies, it was restricted to the elders, and this, you know, in how it used to be used. And Justin Willis and others kind of pick that apart a little bit, this idealized, romanticized kind of notion of the past that comes with this. But you do get a very similar discourse with cannabis as well as cat. But cannabis as well. So people like the Luo, you will read this quite a bit as well. Like, you know, people saying that to the Luo in the past, it was something once restricted to the elders, but, you know, is now kind of something consumed by the young. And there's a bit of an association for some people that it used to be something more respectable, smoking cannabis in this kind of pre-colonial past, which doesn't do justice to all the ambiguities of the past. And I won't go into too much detail again, but there's quite a nice history that myself and Gernot have been trying to fill out a little bit of cannabis consumption in amongst the Baganda, you know, in the Buganda region of Uganda, in the late 19th century. A lot of discourse about cannabis. A discourse influenced a lot by kind of missionization of the region in that kind of era. And there's a lot of negative sentiment that was kind of brewing up, and especially with association with people like Kabaka Mwanga, the Kabaka, you know, a sort of powerful figure, king-like figure of the region at that time, and he actually led some opposition to the British at the time, and so, you know, was kind of persona non grata. And his association with cannabis, his alleged use of cannabis, was one way that, you know, people would really you know, portray him as not a good person in this kind of way. So in that, you know, that kind of time, late 19th century, there were already quite a lot of ambiguities, and no doubt these ambiguities are there before. So this image of you know, past cannabis consumption as something traditional and respectable, you know, that is quite a romanticized, idealized image, but certainly an association that is you know, does seem to have been around. But this kind of image of cannabis as a rural item of traditional consumption would very much change in the 20th century, and very much linked as kind of legal restrictions started being applied in various colonial territories, as, you know, colonial territories started to try and suppress the substance. And legislation in East Africa started emerging in the early 20th century with attempts to kind of regulate and license the trade of substances like opium and bang coming in from East African ports. But kind of a lot of people became quite alarmed by quite high rates of cannabis consumption in places like amongst the Luo in Western Kenya and in Baganda. So people also pressed for cannabis to be more strictly regulated and suppressed, you know, in upcountry East Africa protectorate, that kind of area around Lake Victoria and so forth. So this led to a lot of moves to, and a lot of pressure to suppress cannabis more broadly, which came about in 1913 and 1914, where you know, ordinances which were linked to the Hague Conventions on Opium, but these ordinances that added cannabis into the mix were enforced. And in 1914, cannabis officially, or Indian hemp as it was termed, you know, was added to this ordinance of to suppress it as well. And this very much did seem to have an impact, or according to some commentators, really did, like the coming of these laws did seem to have an impact on who was consuming the substance and where it was being consumed. And Brian, so shifting slightly to these Southern African context, but Brian du Toit, a researcher who wrote a lot about cannabis in South Africa and Africa more broadly in the 70s and 80s. But he describes quite vividly, you know, the change from cannabis before these kind of legal measures were introduced being something that rural elders could consume, you know, in traditional ways quite openly. But once these legal measures came in and cannabis smoking became suppressed, you know, it became something much more associated with, you know, rather than leisurely consumption, it would be people smoking it in very hidden places like, you know, pipe culverts or in underpasses and these kind of things. And also shifted the consumption to more urban spaces and more youth in this kind of analysis of how this association of cannabis seemed to have changed. So yeah, so people like Brian DeToit were drawing out quite a distinction between what happened, as illegality came to bite, and changing the who and the where of cannabis consumption. And this certainly seemed to have happened in the context of Nairobi. So, Nairobi, quite a relatively young city anyway, formed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But certainly by the middle of the 20th century and into the independence era, cannabis really had become very much something associated with urban areas and with an urban underclass, something very much associated with and also with criminality. There's been quite a bit of there's quite a bit of evidence out there, or material that can be used in terms of like ethnographies of prisons that were done in East Africa, in Mombasa in particular, in the 50s and 60s. That really showed kind of high rates of cannabis consumption in those kind of contexts, which links to how cannabis as well gained this association with criminality and so forth as well. But also cannabis became something very much used by people in the more marginalized forms of the economy within urban settings like Nairobi, kind of the hustlers of the urban economy of today, whose precursors were there in colonial times in parts of Nairobi as well. So this really came in. So by the 1970s and 1980s, this does seem to have been the predominant association with cannabis. And here's a newspaper clipping from the 1980s, relates to another project of mine about a part of Nairobi called East Lee, where I've done a project. But this was a cartoon about cannabis being grown by ne'er-do-wells in the East Lee sewage works at that time in the 80s. And also work like Going Down River Road, a famous book by Major Mwangi, I think that was 1980s or 1970s, but famous work of literature where the cannabis smoking is, again, it signifies ne'er-do-wells and kind of the urban underclass in this form. So and also today, so this kind of links to where Gernot will go with a look at Fela Kuti and an interest of ours in popular culture as well in terms of where we're going with our cannabis project. But it's quite interesting how cannabis, certainly in the last 5 years, where interestingly Kenya has a more open debate about cannabis and its legality now, obviously linked to things going on further afield. But in the Kenyan music scene, there's been quite a few open references to bangi, to cannabis in a lot of recent kind of hip hop type genres of music in Nairobi. So this song, and I advise you to look up these songs as well. But a group called Just Imagine Africa, who did a song called entitled Bangi. So again, very, very open in a way that people wouldn't have been quite as open, maybe even 10 years ago. And this guy, Virusi Mbaya, which this is his stage name, a guy from an estate in Nairobi, which this name actually means bad virus. And funnily enough, another word for cannabis in Kenya, a slang name for cannabis, is koro. So this guy has very much played with this in the era of coronavirus and has a song called Coronavirus, which I advise you to check out on YouTube. But this all, I think, all shows, this link of how cannabis, in terms of its association, has, really did shift in the East African context from something, had this association with the elders and tradition, to this thing that's all about kind of respect in this kind of, much more modern sense. So,
but you have 2 more minutes.
Oh, sure. I should hand over to Gernot. Sorry, I've taken up quite a bit of time, Gernot.
No worries. Thanks. I'll try to keep it very short. So what I wanted to do is just sort of compare that a little bit to the West African case or situation, especially in Lagos. And we have very similar developments about these shifts between respectability and towards respect, and then a more recent shift back to respectability. What I have to say in general is that the history of cannabis in West Africa is relatively, or compared to other parts of Africa, relatively short, or at least the documented history of it is relatively short. So where I'm picking up is basically from the 1950s, where cannabis sort of becomes debated in public debates, and especially seen as sort of associated with the sort of urban underclass, similar to what Neil talked about in the Kenyan and maybe also in the South African example. And sort of seen very closely linked to this sort of group of ex-soldiers returning from the Second World War who were considered deviant, and other groups like port workers and youth. So it starts getting this unrespectable sort of image really only in the 1950s, while cannabis was already illegal in most West African countries from the early 20th century. It really starts only becoming debated or unrespectable from the 1950s onwards. So the state actually is not really that interested in cannabis. In the Nigerian example, you have the Indian Hemp Decree of 1966, that's after independence, that actually starts targeting cannabis cultivation and smoking specifically for the first time, and debates about cannabis, a little moral panic at the time also emerging. Please, next slide. What I really wanted to talk about, and that also fits into that context of the 1950s and 60s, is a relatively different debate within a sort of a space of musicians, a space of the Lagos club culture that sees cannabis slightly differently. Here we have a shift actually from cannabis of being something foreign or glamorous towards something of a symbol of defiance, especially in the work of Fela and in his famous music venue, the Shrine in Lagos. And the only thing that I really wanted to say, so you have the 1950s, cannabis at that time is kind of associated with US jazz clubs, US jazz, and in that sense seen as something foreign, not only in the music of Fela, but also in other people like Orlando Obo, who is termed Dr. Ganja at the time, actually, who uses cannabis very extensively in his music, and people listening to it as well. But then you have a shift really from the early 1970s when cannabis becomes a kind of a symbol of resistance against the state, a symbol of resistance against authoritarianism and the corrupt elites, especially in the work of Fela Kuti. So cannabis is not seen as this foreign thing anymore. It's actually seen as a natural grown herb, the African drug par excellence. So it's not also called Indian hemp anymore or ganja, but it's called Igbo, which is the Yoruba name for cannabis. And it's quite, if you look at these performances in the Shrine, which was founded as an institution in 1970, sort of it gets quite a specific identity in this work. Is distinguished from other drugs like cocaine and heroin in the early 80s and in late 70s as the sort of African drug vis-a-vis these foreign elitist drugs, and also gets this notion of being a substance of the poor, in that sense, getting quite a lot of what Neil talked about in terms of respect. Why did it change? For various reasons, you know, how these drugs change change in their perceptions about drugs change for various reasons. In part, this is linked to Fela's own take at his music. You know, he was heavily influenced by the Black Power movement, by Pan-Africanism, and also starts singing in Pidgin English and in Yoruba, for example, at the time. The Shrine, I'll show you some pictures of that on the next slide, is a very specific...
you have to wrap up now, I think. Okay,
yes, a specific cultural sort of institution that actually a sort of alternative political space, which at one point actually creates a state within a state, the Calcutta Republic. But the main thing is sort of this gets then sanitized later on. So you have got political figures like the French president actually visiting the Shrine, claiming he was there in the early 2000s. So the Shrine and Fela's music after his death in the late 90s sort of becomes more respectable. There's very little reference to cannabis. There's also a musical, which I haven't seen yet, but maybe some people have seen already about Fela. So Fela and his music becomes sanitized in a way, becomes more respectable. But I would argue, and that's the last slide, cannabis still, especially its use, becomes not respectable at all. Although some of its production more recently, because international debates do have an impact on African debates on cannabis, and there are specific African debates on cannabis, and we might hear about that in the case of South Africa as well. So the production actually of cannabis gained some respect, whereas on the street, its use still has this notion of being a countercultural drug to some degree. But if there's any questions about anything related to Nigeria, please feel free to ask them afterwards.